Woodridge? And the answer was, you don't have one. And so I could look at these statistics and say either you don't have a YMCA in Woodridge or you have a poor YMCA in Woodridge. You know, like a small one that was built 30, 40 years ago. Because those are low numbers for YMCAs. And then we look at what are the levels of satisfaction. So when you look overall at your park system, you have 60% are very or somewhat satisfied with the value received from the park district. And that's higher than the national benchmark at 61%. The Illinois benchmark is 67%, and you're at 69%. You can see only 5% of people are very dissatisfied or somewhat dissatisfied, as opposed to the 69% who are very satisfied or somewhat. But I think actually this is an area where, if I was going to say bumping it up, this is an area where you can bump up, because you have 27% who are very satisfied, but while we've had communities in Illinois that are as high as the upper 30s as far as very satisfied. So this is an area, I think, where you can move somewhat into the 70s, but I would really suggest that you want to move from 27% very satisfied into at least the low 30s as you look towards the plan over the next 5 years. And you could do that by concentrating on the things that are most important to people. That's really the key. So, let me just stop there for a second, because somebody said to me beforehand, they said, gee, you gave a really good presentation last time, Ron. And I almost said, well, you know, I give a good presentation when people like the results. And I don't give a very good presentation when people don't like the results. So you have to look from a standpoint that these are averages. So half the time that I give a presentation, I'm looking at people and saying, you're below the average. You know, and I try to put a positive spin on it, but nobody likes to hear they're below the average. So, you know, people like to hear a lot more, we're above the average. And in your case, unusually, in every single area, you're above the average. And that's very unusual for me to find that. So I will give a better presentation if the news is better. And in this case, the news is that. But it's really, this is what your citizens are saying. I'm just mouthing what your citizens have told us. So that's what your current situation is with your park district. The next thing that people are going to say is, okay, as we look to the future, and if we want to maintain a really good system, and even improve upon a really good system, what should we do? And so we want to look at needs, we want to look at unmet needs, and we want to look at priorities. So how do we do that? Well, the first thing that we do is we look through about 26, 27 different types of indoor and outdoor facilities, and we ask people, do you have a need for that facility? And I think that you said, Miss, that you got a survey, right?
Yes, I did.
And so can I just ask you on this? When you got the survey and it said, do you have a need for neighborhood parks? Yes or no? How did you answer that question?
Yes.
Yes. And when the survey said, you have a need for bicycle pathway system, yes or no? How did you answer that?
Yes.
Yes. And we said, do you have a need for outdoor tennis courts? Did you answer yes or no?
No.
No. Okay. The typical family, when they're looking at all of these 26, 27, they will say they have a need for about 8 to 10 different facilities. That's pretty typical. They will say they have a need for that. So when you really look at people who say that they have a need, you know, you could come down to here and say, gee, only 26% said they have a need for outdoor basketball courts, and maybe even multi-use is 23%. That's where I said that you really need to look at households with children, because when you're looking at households, all households, less than 50% of households have children. So naturally, those items that really relate to children are going to be a little bit lower, but if you break it down by the demographics, they're a lot higher. In other words, of the households that have children, they are significantly higher than the 23%. And that's one of the things you need to look at. But if you look at these percentages, neighborhood parks, that means that 9,300 households agreed with you that they have a need for neighborhood parks. 7,900 households agree with you that they have a need for bicycle pathway systems. And when we looked at outdoor tennis courts, where you were indicating you don't have a need, but there were close to 5,000 households who did say that they have a need for that. So you can see in every one of these cases, that's a lot of households. And there's no one in the survey that ever answers things right or wrong. It's their opinion. Yes, sir.
So, from
this survey, you're saying that the residents in Woodridge say they have a greater need for a fishing pier on ponds than they do for baseball or softball fields.
We're saying when they're asked the question, fishing piers on ponds, that will relate to anybody's between the ages of 0 and between the ages of 100. So when you're looking...
My question is, this chart represents the Woodridge community. And the Woodridge community has come back and said, out of those 508, that there's a greater need for a fishing pier or pond. They have a greater need for a fishing pier on a pond than they do for baseball or softball fields.
They are saying that a greater percentage of those households have a need for fishing piers and ponds than for baseball and softball fields. They're saying that a greater percentage of them. But if I can, let me get into the next stage of that. Okay? But they are saying that. They're not saying, though, how often they're going to use it. They may use a fishing pond, they have a need for it, but they may use that 5 or 6 times a year. They may have, less people might have a need for softball and baseball fields, but they're going to use that 50 times a year. So you have to look at both ways. This isn't measuring how often they use it, this is measuring the percentage that say they have a need. But if I could come back then to you, and I'm not trying to pick on you, but you said before that you have a need for neighborhood parks. So if somebody would say to you, are your needs right now 100% being met? Are they 75% being met? Are they 50% being met? 25 or 0? In other words, all your needs. How would you answer that?
Personally, 100%.
100%. So that would mean you have 0 need for any other neighborhood parks.
I live in a great neighborhood with a great
That's
park.
great. That's fantastic. We asked the same thing of bicycle pathway systems. How would you answer it? 100%? Right now, are your needs 100% met? 75, 50, 25, or 0?
Close to 100.
Close to 100. Okay, that's great. When we ask people in the community, because this is what Mike was talking about. When we ask people about neighborhood parks, 56% answered exactly what you just did. That their needs are 100% being met. They're totally happy with neighborhood parks. An additional 31% said that they were, their needs were 75%. Now, getting back to what your point was earlier, we're not talking about everyone. We're just talking about that percentage of people who said they have a need for neighborhood parks. So we're talking about those 9,000 households. Those are the only ones who are asking that question of. Does that make sense? So, of that 9,000, and what 56% is a big number. Anytime you get over 30% of people saying they have 100% of their needs are being met, that's a big number. And that's really saying that people are very, very satisfied with your neighborhood park system. And that gets back to your maintenance, and that gets back to how many neighborhood parks you have. What was that number, Mike?
About 50.
50 is a lot of neighborhood parks for a community your size. A lot. I was a director of Parks and Recreation in 25,000 people. We had 87 neighborhood parks. 50 neighborhood parks is a lot of parks. When you look at your playground equipment, I talked about 30%. 52% said that their needs are 100% being met. So you're looking, we don't need that anymore. And that kind of gets to your point before, is you could have a need, but your need can be 100% being met, and therefore you don't need to do anything else. Where your needs are not being met in your community, of the 3,000 households, now that's a third of the households who say they have a need for neighborhood parks. Of the 3,000 who say they have a need for multi-use sports fields, indoor, only 15% say that their needs are 100% being met. 37% said that their needs are 0 being met. Of those who say that they have a need for indoor running track, only 13% said that their needs are 100% being met. 50% say that their needs are 0. And that's 6,000 households, so about 2/3 of the neighborhood parks. So the first thing we look at is, do you have a need? And what percentage of people and the numbers, and then the next thing we said is, how much are your needs being met? And I personally feel that's a more important statistic than the first, because if everybody said, you have a need, but your needs are 100% being met, it would be a waste of money to put more dollars into that, right? You want to maintain that, but you don't want to double the amount of money because you're already 100% satisfied. Yes?
How can anybody say their needs are 100% met on an indoor walking or running track?
Well,
We don't have
because it says it's available to you as a community, so you could